Greetings and welcome back to Room 303, AP English and our Roberts Lectures. We are in the poetry section. We turn now on page 660 to Jim Northrup's Ogichidag, the 1993 offering. Northrup, his dates 1943 to 2016. Recently we lost this great writer, this great author, great poet, great linguist of the Ogichidag tradition. The title Ogichidag is the Ojibwa word for warriors, and so put it in your notes right away. This is going to be a poem about warriors. Of course, it's going to have an interestingly ironic tone, which has made many read this poem as a clearly anti-war poem. We'll obviously debate that once we've heard it. Let's listen to Jim Northrup just read it and then enjoy some conversation.
Ogichidag. I was born in war, WW2. Heard the old men tell stories of getting gassed in the trenches, WW1. Saw my uncles come back from Guadalcanal, North Africa, in the Battle of the Bulge. Memorized the war stories my cousins told of Korea. Felt the fear in their voices. Finally, it was my turn, my brothers too. Joined the Marines in time for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Heard the crack of rifle fire in the rice paddies south of Da Nang. Saw my friends die there, then tasted the bitterness of the only war America ever lost. My son is now a warrior. Will I listen to his stories or cry into his open grave?
Now, how you read the final question of this poem will have a lot to do with obviously how you read this poem. Notice the historicity of this poem. We begin, by the way, with his birth. He says, born in World War II. Notice then World War I is referenced in the old-timers, the uncles coming back and talking about the horrors of war. We find ourselves immediately thinking about novels such as Catch-22 or All Quiet on the Western Front. Notice the verb memorized at line 7. War stories. Notice the comment in line 9, felt the fear in their voices. That is to say, people who had gone to war come back and then had to relate some experience of that kind of situation, right? Finally, he says it was his turn. The word finally has a certain finality to it, doesn't it? It's almost as if he's suggesting, the speaker of the poem, that getting involved in fighting and conflict in the war was an inevitability. It was only a matter of time. The family produced the culture from which, the language from which he had grown up listening to, obviously going off to fight. Finds himself in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then later his friends dying in Vietnam. The only war America ever lost. Notice the observation there, which is a disturbing line on so many counts. My son, the final lines now, is now a warrior. Ogichidag is the word. Then the rhetorical question, will I listen to his war stories or cry into his open grave? Now, why open? Well, the same information as we saw it in Randall Jarrell's Death of the Bolter at Gunner, if there's no remains to come back. Or, obviously, the open, meaning they haven't filled it in yet over the casket. Let's work really quickly at levels 2 and 3. Obviously, at 2A, major messages here. The uncertainty of war, the inevitability of war, the hell-like nature of war, and, of course, the question about parents and their children as it relates to conflict and war. At 2B, obviously, the symbol of history is profound, as well as, of course, that open grave at the conclusion of the poem. At 3A, so many titles come to mind, poems that we will have studied: Crane's War is Kind, Death of the Bolter at Gunner. Of course, we can go back to Thomas Hardy, The Man He Killed, and any number of other poems. We mentioned titles of novels as well. Finally, at 3B, how about this one to try to relate to this in some way? What is a moment in time of your past that had anything to do with conflict and war? Have you had or lost relatives who were a part of war. How about this one? If you had to fight in a war, could you? If you had to fight in a war, would you? We think of Tim O'Brien's On Rainy River as a classic example of that question of wanting to somehow escape and not go off to fight in a conflict. In that case, it was the Vietnam War. This is, of course, one of those really sacred texts in 303 because it resurrects the question about would you, could you, right? Well, it's an unsettling poem, and yet I think a very powerful and necessary one. I hope it leads you to more of Jim Northrup's work. Thank you.